the 8th of February, 1587. In the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, a makeshift scaffold draped in black cloth dominates the stone chamber. The air is thick with anticipation and dread as nobles, clergy, and officials crowd together, their breath visible in the bitter winter cold. At the center of this grim theater sits a wooden block, its surface already stained dark from previous use. Soon, a woman of 44 years will kneel before this crude altar of state-sanctioned vengeance. Her auburn hair, now streaked with gray after nearly 19 years of captivity, will be severed along with her head in an execution so bungled and barbaric that it will horrify even the bloodthirsty courts of Renaissance Europe. This is Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, granddaughter of Henry VII, and by many accounts, the rightful heir to the English throne. The woman who once ruled Scotland as an infant, who was Queen of France before her 16th birthday, who danced in the glittering palaces of Europe, will die today in a cold English castle, branded a traitor by her own cousin. But Mary's execution will not be the swift, dignified end reserved for royalty. Instead, it will become a grotesque spectacle of incompetence and cruelty that required 3 separate blows of the axe to complete. What makes Mary's death particularly chilling isn't just the physical brutality she endured in those final moments, though that was horrific enough. It's the calculated campaign of character assassination that preceded it, the systematic destruction of a woman who represented everything Elizabeth I's Protestant England feared: Catholic legitimacy, foreign influence, and the ever-present threat of dynastic upheaval. For nearly 2 decades, Mary had been kept alive, but powerless, a living ghost haunting England's political landscape. Her very existence challenged Elizabeth's right to rule, her Catholic faith threatened the Protestant settlement, and her potential heirs promised future chaos. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was not merely the elimination of a political rival, it was the public murder of royal blood, an act so shocking that even Elizabeth's most trusted advisors understood they were crossing a line from which there could be no return. European monarchs, regardless of their religious differences, viewed the execution as a dangerous precedent that diminished the sacred nature of kingship itself. If a queen could be dragged to the block like a common criminal, what protection did any crowned head truly possess? But perhaps most disturbing of all was how Mary's death revealed the cold machinery of Tudor statecraft. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of political panic. It was the culmination of years of careful legal maneuvering, manufactured evidence, and diplomatic theater. Elizabeth's government had spent decades building the case for Mary's execution, turning her from a fellow queen seeking sanctuary into a dangerous conspirator who deserved death. They had systematically isolated her, monitored her correspondence, and entrapped her in plots that may have been largely of their own making. The woman who would die at Fotheringhay had once been one of the most beautiful and accomplished princesses in Europe. She spoke 6 languages, wrote poetry, played musical instruments, and had been raised in the sophisticated French court. She had survived the murder of her secretary, before her eyes, the brutal assassination of her second husband, and the forced abdication that cost her the Scottish throne. She had endured imprisonment, miscarriages, and the gradual erosion of hope that comes with decades of captivity. Yet Mary would face her executioner with a dignity that shamed her captors and transformed her final moments from a display of English power into something approaching martyrdom. Her courage on the scaffold would accomplish what years of plotting and conspiracy had failed to achieve. It would make her dangerous again, not as a living rival, but as a dead saint whose memory would inspire Catholic resistance for generations to come. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, stands as one of history's most politically significant beheadings, a moment when the personal became irrevocably political, when family bonds shattered against the demands of statecraft, and when the Tudor machinery of power revealed its most ruthless face. What happened in that cold hall at Fotheringhay would echo through the courts of Europe and ultimately contribute to the very conflicts Elizabeth had sought to prevent. Picture this: a queen, barely 25 years old, stripped of her crown, her freedom, her dignity. For 18 long years, Mary Stuart, once Queen of Scots, once Queen Consort of France, would wake each morning not in a palace, but in a series of English manor houses that served as little more than gilded cages. Her guards were her constant companions, her correspondence monitored, her every movement scrutinized by spies answering to her own cousin. What transforms a woman from sovereign ruler to state prisoner isn't always a single dramatic betrayal. Sometimes it's the slow, methodical dismantling of power, executed with the cold precision that only family can manage. In May of 1568, Mary had fled Scotland after a series of catastrophic political miscalculations that culminated in military defeat at the Battle of Langside. Her marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, widely suspected of murdering her previous husband, Lord Darnley, had turned both her nobles and her people against her. Desperate and with nowhere else to turn, she made what would prove to be the defining mistake of her life. She crossed the border into England, throwing herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth Tudor. Elizabeth faced an impossible dilemma. Here was a woman with a legitimate claim to the English throne. Many Catholics considered Mary's claim superior to Elizabeth's own. Yet Mary arrived not as a conquering enemy, but as a fellow queen seeking sanctuary, invoking the sacred bonds of kinship and royal blood. To execute her would be unconscionable regicide. To release her would be to invite invasion or rebellion. Elizabeth's solution was as brilliant as it was cruel: indefinite protective custody. What followed was nearly 2 decades of psychological warfare disguised as hospitality. Mary was moved between various country estates: Sheffield Castle, Chatsworth, Tutbury Castle, Fotheringhay, each transition carefully orchestrated to prevent her from establishing lasting relationships or reliable communication networks. Her keepers changed regularly. First, the Earl of Shrewsbury, then the puritanical Sir Amyas Paulet, each man chosen for his loyalty to Elizabeth and his resistance to Mary's considerable personal charm. The conditions of her imprisonment grew progressively harsher. Initially granted a household of 30 servants, Mary saw her retinue steadily reduced to a handful of loyal attendants. Her letters were intercepted and decoded. Her movements were restricted to progressively smaller areas within each estate. By the 1580s, she was forbidden even to take exercise in the gardens without armed escort. Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, had woven an invisible web around Mary so tight that every word she spoke, every message she attempted to send, every visitor who sought audience with her was monitored, analyzed, and reported back to the English court. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of her imprisonment was its very ambiguity. Mary was never formally charged with a crime, never brought to trial, never given a sentence with defined terms. She existed in a legal limbo, simultaneously honored as a fellow sovereign and treated as a dangerous criminal. This uncertainty corroded her psyche more effectively than any rack or thumbscrew. She aged rapidly, her health deteriorating from a combination of physical inactivity, chronic stress, and what we would now recognize as severe depression. The isolation was particularly devastating for a woman accustomed to being the center of political and social life. Mary had once commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and held court with the most powerful figures in Europe. Now her world had shrunk to a few rooms and the faces of her captors. Letters to foreign courts took months to reach their destinations, when they weren't intercepted entirely. News of the outside world arrived filtered through her jailers, if it arrived at all. Yet Mary's very existence continued to destabilize Elizabeth's reign. Catholic plots swirled around her name, whether she participated in them or not. The Ridolfi plot in 1571, the Throckmorton plot in 1583, each conspiracy reinforced Elizabeth's conviction that as long as Mary lived, England would never be secure. Mary had become what Elizabeth most feared, a living symbol of Catholic legitimacy, a focal point for every discontented noble and foreign enemy. By 1586, after 18 years of this exquisite torture, Both women were trapped in a deadly game neither could win and neither could abandon. For 19 years, Mary Stuart remained locked away in English castles, a living reminder of Elizabeth's greatest fear, that England's Catholics might one day rally behind a legitimate rival to her throne. But imprisonment alone was never going to be enough for Elizabeth's advisors. They needed something more permanent, more final. They needed Mary to seal her own fate with her own hand. The opportunity came through a web of conspiracy that would have impressed even the most seasoned court intriguers. In 1586, a young Catholic nobleman named Anthony Babington began corresponding with Mary about a plot that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The plan was audacious in its scope. Assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary from her prison, and place the Scottish Queen on the English throne with the backing of a Spanish invasion force. What Mary didn't know was that every letter she received, every response she carefully crafted, was being read by Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham. Walsingham had spent years constructing an elaborate intelligence network that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. His agents had infiltrated Catholic circles across Europe, turned priests into informants, and created a system of surveillance that reached into the most private chambers of aristocratic homes. The Babington plot wasn't just discovered by Walsingham's network, it was essentially orchestrated by it. The spy master had agents provocateurs encouraging the conspiracy, double agents feeding information to both sides, and cryptographers who had long since broken the codes that Mary believed kept her communications secret. Mary's letters to Babington were damning in their clarity. She didn't merely acknowledge the plot. She embraced it with an enthusiasm that her defenders would struggle to explain away for centuries. In her own hand, she wrote detailed suggestions for the assassination, requested specific numbers of foreign troops for the invasion, and even provided advice on how to free her from Fotheringhay Castle. Most crucially, she explicitly gave her consent to what she called the tragic execution of Elizabeth, sealing her cousin's death warrant with her own words. But the conspiracy went deeper than simple assassination. Mary had been in contact with Philip II of Spain for years, encouraging him to view her as the rightful Catholic heir to England's throne. She had written to the Pope, seeking his blessing for various schemes against Elizabeth's government. She had corresponded with Catholic nobles across Europe, presenting herself as a martyr for the faith and a rallying point for English Catholics who felt oppressed under Protestant rule. Each letter, each secret communication, was another thread in the rope that would eventually hang her. The legal case against Mary presented unprecedented challenges. She was a foreign queen, not technically subject to English law. She had never sworn allegiance to Elizabeth, never acknowledged her authority. Her supporters argued that trying her for treason was legally impossible. How could someone commit treason against a sovereign they didn't recognize? But Elizabeth's parliament had anticipated this problem. In 1585, they had passed the Act for the Queen's Safety, which specifically made it treason for anyone to plot against Elizabeth's life, regardless of their nationality or status. When the trial began at Fotheringhay Castle in October 1586, Mary faced a commission of 36 peers and high officials. She appeared in person, dressed in black velvet, but wearing a crucifix prominently displayed, a deliberate reminder of the religious dimensions of the conflict. Mary's defense was both defiant and legally sophisticated. She argued that as a sovereign queen, she could not be tried by English subjects. She claimed that her letters had been forged, that Walsingham's agents had manipulated her words. She insisted that even if she had written the letters, she was responding to years of unjust imprisonment and had every right to seek her freedom. But the evidence was overwhelming. Walsingham presented letter after letter in Mary's own handwriting and sealed with her personal seal. The court heard testimony from Babington himself, who confessed under torture to the entire plot. They examined the decoded messages that laid out the conspiracy in methodical detail. Most damning of all, they heard Mary's own words approving what she called the final remedy, the assassination of the woman who had kept her prisoner for nearly 2 decades. The verdict was inevitable. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was found guilty of high treason against Elizabeth I of England. The sentence was death. For nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth had crafted an elaborate performance of reluctance. Every letter intercepted, every plot uncovered, every nobleman demanding Mary's head, Elizabeth would furrow her brow, pace her chambers, and declare herself tormented by the impossible choice. But this was political theater of the highest order. The queen, who had survived assassination attempts, foreign invasions, and domestic rebellions, was not a woman paralyzed by indecision. She was buying time, calculating angles, waiting for the perfect moment when executing her cousin would appear not as royal murder, but as reluctant necessity. The Babington plot changed everything. When Francis Walsingham's spy network intercepted Mary's letters, explicitly endorsing a plan to assassinate Elizabeth, the political calculus shifted irrevocably. Here, finally, was proof that could satisfy even Elizabeth's most cautious advisors. Mary had not merely plotted against the crown, she had conspired to murder the anointed Queen of England. The evidence was damning, written in Mary's own hand, sealed with her own seal. Parliament, the Privy Council, even moderate voices who had long counselled mercy now spoke with one voice: Mary Stuart must die. But executing a fellow monarch was not simply a matter of justice. It was a seismic political earthquake that would reshape the entire European order. Elizabeth understood that the moment Mary's head fell, she would cross a line that no English ruler had ever crossed. She would become the queen who killed a queen, the sovereign who demonstrated that royal blood offered no divine protection. Every monarch in Europe would watch in horror and fascination as Elizabeth shattered the carefully maintained fiction that kings and queens were untouchable. The pressure was relentless. William Cecil, her most trusted advisor, presented her with intelligence reports showing that Philip II of Spain was already massing an invasion fleet. Mary alive was dangerous enough, but Mary as a martyred Catholic saint would become a rallying cry that could unite all of Catholic Europe against Protestant England. Cecil's argument was brutally simple. Kill Mary now, or watch her become the symbol that destroys everything Elizabeth had built. Elizabeth's own nobles were equally insistent, but for different reasons. They had watched Mary's supporters penetrate deep into English society, recruiting conspirators, funneling foreign gold, turning loyal subjects into potential assassins. To them, Mary represented an existential threat to their power, their wealth, their very lives. If she ever reached the throne, the Catholic restoration that would follow would mean confiscated lands, ruined families, destroyed fortunes. Their demands for execution carried the unmistakable undertone of an ultimatum. Yet Elizabeth hesitated, and her hesitation was not merely performance. She genuinely understood the terrible precedent she was about to set. If a queen could be executed for treason, what protection did any ruler possess? Moreover, Mary was not just any foreign monarch. She was Elizabeth's own cousin, her heir by blood, if not by law. The woman Elizabeth was preparing to kill was, in some parallel universe where different choices had been made, the person who might have stood beside her as family. The legal framework had been meticulously constructed. Parliament had passed the Act for the Queen's Surety, specifically designed to make Mary's execution legally unassailable. The trial had followed every proper form, with evidence presented, witnesses examined, and judgment rendered by qualified commissioners. Elizabeth's lawyers assured her that Mary's execution would be legally justified, historically defensible, and politically necessary. The paperwork was perfect. The justification was ironclad. But Elizabeth also recognized that legal technicalities would provide cold comfort if this decision triggered the collapse of her reign. She was gambling that England was strong enough to survive the Catholic backlash, that her navy could repel Spanish invasion, that her subjects would rally behind her rather than rally behind Mary's martyred memory. She was betting her throne, her life, and her kingdom on the calculation that eliminating Mary would strengthen rather than destroy her position. On February 1st, 1587, Elizabeth finally signed Mary's death warrant. Her signature was steady, her resolve apparently firm. She had made her choice. Mary, Queen of Scots, would die not because Elizabeth was cruel, but because 20 years of careful political maneuvering had led inexorably to this moment. The execution was not an act of passion or revenge. It was the logical conclusion of a chess game that had been playing out across 2 decades, with the fate of 2 kingdoms hanging in the balance. The axe blade struck Mary's neck with a dull thud, but instead of the swift, clean death expected of royal executions, something went horribly wrong. The 44-year-old former Queen of Scotland remained conscious, her lips moving in silent prayer as blood poured from the savage wound. The executioner would need to strike twice more before her ordeal finally ended. What unfolded on that February morning in 1587 was not the dignified end of a queen, but a butchered spectacle that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. The great hall at Fotheringay Castle had been transformed into an execution chamber. A wooden scaffold, draped in black cloth, dominated the space. Around 300 witnesses packed the room, nobles, officials, and local dignitaries who had come to witness history. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Mary Stuart walked into the hall with remarkable composure. She wore a black velvet dress over a crimson petticoat, the color of Catholic martyrdom hidden beneath her outer garments like a final act of defiance. Mary's dignity in those final moments was extraordinary. She forgave her executioners in advance, declaring she hoped her death would bring an end to the troubles of the realm. Her servants wept openly as they removed her outer garments, revealing the deep red satin bodice and petticoat beneath. The symbolism was unmistakable. She would die as a Catholic martyr. With steady hands, she placed a white cloth over her eyes and knelt at the block, stretching out her arms and crying, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Then the horror began. The first blow from the executioner's axe missed its mark entirely, striking the back of Mary's skull and opening a gaping wound. Witnesses reported hearing a low groan escape her lips. She was still alive, still conscious. The executioner, his hands trembling now, raised the axe again. The second blow cut deeper into her neck, but failed to sever it completely. Mary's lips continued moving in what appeared to be prayer, blood streaming down her face and pooling on the scaffold. Contemporary accounts describe the executioner's panic as he realized his incompetence was prolonging the Queen's agony. The third blow finally completed the beheading, but even then, the ordeal was far from over. When the executioner lifted Mary's head to display it to the crowd, shouting, "God save the Queen!" the auburn hair came away in his hands, revealing Mary's own grey, closely cropped head beneath the wig. The head tumbled to the floor with a sickening thud. The medical reality of what Mary endured defies comprehension. Modern forensic analysis suggests that with the first blow, she would have experienced excruciating pain as the axe shattered her skull and damaged her spinal cord without immediately causing death. The second blow would have severed major arteries while leaving her partially conscious. For precious minutes that must have felt like hours, Mary Stuart remained aware of her own brutal dismemberment. But perhaps most disturbing of all was what happened next. As officials moved to examine the body, Mary's small Skye Terrier emerged from beneath her petticoats, where it had hidden throughout the execution. The little dog, soaked in its mistress's blood, refused to leave her side and howled piteously. Witnesses described the animal's loyalty as heartbreaking, a final reminder of Mary's humanity in the midst of political brutality. The executioner's bungling had transformed what should have been a swift political necessity into a nightmarish spectacle. Dean Fletcher, who had attempted to force Protestant prayers upon Mary in her final moments, was visibly shaken by what he had witnessed. Even hardened courtiers who had called for Mary's death found themselves disturbed by the prolonged suffering they had witnessed. Elizabeth I's government had intended Mary's execution to demonstrate the power and justice of Protestant England. Instead, They had created a martyrdom that would resonate across Catholic Europe for generations. The woman who had entered that hall as Elizabeth's captive cousin died as something far more dangerous. A symbol of Catholic resistance whose suffering had been witnessed by hundreds and would be recounted by thousands. In the end, the brutal incompetence of Mary's executioners achieved what 18 years of imprisonment could not. They transformed a deposed queen into an enduring martyr whose bloody death would stain England's reputation for centuries to come. News of Mary's death spread through Europe like wildfire, carried by merchants, diplomats, and messengers who had witnessed the gruesome spectacle. Within days, the courts of Catholic Europe were buzzing with horrified accounts of the botched execution, how the first blow had missed her neck entirely, how the second had left her head hanging by sinews, how the executioner had grimly finished his work with a sawing motion that sickened even the hardened witnesses. But it was the discovery that followed that truly shocked the European nobility to their core. When the executioner lifted what he believed to be Mary's head to display to the crowd, her grey wig slipped off, revealing the nearly bald skull of a prematurely aged woman. The head fell from his hands onto the platform with a sickening thud. Here was the woman they had known as one of the most beautiful queens of her generation, reduced to this pitiful, mutilated corpse. The symbolic power of the moment was not lost on anyone. This was what happened to anointed monarchs who crossed Elizabeth Tudor. Elizabeth's own reaction revealed the complex web of emotions and political calculations that had led to this moment. When news of the execution reached her, she flew into what appeared to be a rage of grief and horror. She claimed she had never intended for the death warrant to be carried out, that it had been sent without her knowledge or consent. She wept, she raged, she declared herself devastated by the loss of her sister queen. Yet those close to Elizabeth understood the performance. She had signed the warrant knowing full well what it meant, but now she needed to distance herself from the political fallout that was already beginning to cascade across Europe. Her scapegoat was William Davison, her Secretary of State, who had delivered the warrant to Fotheringhay. Elizabeth had him arrested, fined, and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Davison, who had served faithfully and done exactly what his queen had tacitly commanded, became the sacrificial lamb for Elizabeth's political theatre. He spent 2 years in the Tower, his career destroyed, his family impoverished, all so that Elizabeth could maintain the fiction that Mary's death had been an unfortunate accident of overzealous subordinates. But Elizabeth's theatrical grief could not contain the genuine shockwaves reverberating through the royal courts of Europe. King Philip II of Spain, already contemplating military action against Protestant England, now had the perfect justification for holy war. Mary's death was not just regicide. It was the murder of a Catholic queen by a Protestant usurper, a crime that demanded divine retribution. The Spanish war machine, already the most formidable in Europe, began preparing for what would become the Spanish Armada. Pope Sixtus V declared Elizabeth excommunicated and called for all Catholic princes to take up arms against the English heretic. The papal bull that followed Mary's execution was far more severe than previous condemnations. This time, the Pope offered plenary indulgences to anyone who participated in Elizabeth's overthrow and promised financial support for any Catholic prince brave enough to invade England. In France, the reaction was more complex but equally dangerous for Elizabeth. Henri III, despite his own political struggles with Catholic extremists, could not ignore the execution of a queen who had once been Queen of France. French courtiers who had known Mary during her years as Dauphine and Queen expressed genuine horror at the manner of her death. The French ambassador to England wrote to his king, describing the execution in terms that bordered on the apocalyptic. This was not justice, but barbarity dressed up in legal robes. Perhaps most tellingly, the execution had shattered the fiction that royal blood provided any protection against political calculation. Queens and kings across Europe looked at Mary's fate and saw their own potential future. If Elizabeth could execute an anointed queen, her own cousin, what protection did divine right really offer? The comfortable assumption that royal blood was sacred had been destroyed on the scaffold at Fotheringhay, replaced by a new and terrifying reality. In the emerging world of religious and political warfare, no one was safe. The immediate consequence was clear. Elizabeth had solved her Mary problem, but in doing so, she had painted a target on England that would define the remainder of her reign. The ships of the Spanish Armada were already being prepared in the harbors of Cadiz and Lisbon, carrying with them the fury of Catholic Europe and the promise of retribution for the broken, nearly severed head of Mary, Queen of Scots. In the immediate aftermath of Mary's death, European courts reacted with calculated outrage and genuine horror. Catholic monarchs like Philip II of Spain saw her execution as both an opportunity and an atrocity. An opportunity to position themselves as defenders of the faith while expressing genuine revulsion at the brutal spectacle. Even Protestant rulers privately questioned whether Elizabeth had crossed a line that separated legitimate justice from savage theatricality. The French court, caught between diplomatic necessity and dynastic memory, mourned a woman who had once been their queen while carefully avoiding any commitment to avenge her. But it was the manner of Mary's death, not merely the fact of it, that carved itself into historical memory. The 3 axe blows, the wig that came away in the executioner's hand, the little dog hiding beneath her petticoats, these details transformed a political execution into something approaching medieval horror show. Contemporary accounts spread across Europe like wildfire, each retelling adding new layers of symbolic meaning to the already grotesque reality. Within Protestant England, the execution initially served Elizabeth's purposes. Mary was dead, the Catholic threat neutralized, and the brutal spectacle sent a clear message about the fate of traitors. But as years passed, even Elizabeth's own courtiers began to view the execution with unease. The Queen herself, who had agonized over signing the death warrant, reportedly never spoke of Mary's death again. A silence that historians have interpreted as everything from political calculation to genuine remorse. The Catholic Church moved swiftly to transform Mary into a martyr. Jesuit writings portrayed her final hours as a triumph of faith over heretical persecution, emphasizing her composure, her prayers, and her dignity in the face of Protestant brutality. These accounts deliberately downplayed the messy, human reality of her death, the terror, the botched beheading, the undignified aftermath, in favor of a sanitized narrative of holy suffering. By 1600, Mary had become a rallying cry for Catholic resistance movements across Europe. Protestant historians took the opposite approach, emphasizing Mary's supposed crimes while quietly minimizing the disturbing details of her execution. They portrayed her death as divine justice, finally catching up with a woman who had murdered her husband, committed adultery, and plotted against her lawful sovereign. The image they constructed was of a dangerous seductress whose tears and prayers at the scaffold were merely final acts of manipulation. As the centuries passed, these competing narratives began to merge into something more complex and troubling. Victorian historians, fascinated by Mary's tragic romance and appalled by the brutality of her death, began to view the execution as a symbol of an earlier age's cruelty. They emphasized Elizabeth's reluctance to sign the death warrant, portraying both queens as victims of male political machinations rather than active participants in their own destinies. The 20th century brought psychological analysis to Mary's story. Historians began examining the execution through the lens of trauma, political theater, and systematic character assassination. They recognized that Mary's death was not simply the culmination of a treason trial, but the final act in a decades-long campaign to destroy her legitimacy and transform her from a rival queen into a cautionary tale about female ambition. Modern scholarship has been increasingly uncomfortable with the execution's legacy. Feminist historians point to the gendered nature of the charges against Mary, adultery, murder, sexual manipulation, and argue that she was condemned as much for being an independent woman as for any actual crimes. They note the stark contrast between Mary's brutal end and the relatively dignified deaths afforded to male political prisoners of comparable status. Popular culture has embraced Mary's story with varying degrees of historical accuracy. Films, novels, and television series have alternately portrayed her as romantic heroine, tragic victim, and dangerous schemer. But these popular narratives almost invariably soft-focus the brutal reality of her death, preferring noble suffering to the messy, prolonged horror described by contemporary witnesses. Perhaps most significantly, Mary's execution has come to represent something larger than the death of one woman. It stands as a symbol of religious conflict, political manipulation, and the particular vulnerabilities faced by women who dared to claim power in their own right. The image of the botched beheading, requiring 3 blows, the wig falling away, the executioner holding aloft a severed head, has become a metaphor for the violent intersection of personal ambition and political necessity that defined the Tudor age. In this sense, Mary Stuart achieved in death what she never managed in life. She became truly unforgettable. The date was February 8, 1587, but Mary Stuart's story didn't end when the executioner finally severed her head from her neck on that third, desperate swing of the axe. In many ways, that botched beheading in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle was merely the beginning of a different kind of life, one where Mary, Queen of Scots, would prove far more dangerous in death than she had ever been while drawing breath. What makes Mary's execution so enduringly compelling isn't just the shocking incompetence of her beheading, though that certainly sears itself into memory. It's the uncomfortable questions her death forces us to confront about power, legitimacy, and the lengths to which rulers will go to eliminate threats. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who spent decades cultivating an image of divine authority, had just publicly butchered her cousin, an anointed queen, like a common criminal. The symbolism was impossible to ignore, and it reverberated across every royal court in Europe. Consider the medical reality of what witnesses saw that February morning, when the executioner lifted what he believed to be Mary's severed head, only to watch her grey wig fall away and her actual head tumble to the floor. The assembled crowd wasn't just witnessing an execution gone wrong, they were watching the literal disintegration of the concept of sacred kingship. The divinely appointed Queen of Scotland had been reduced to a grotesque puppet show, her dignity stripped away along with her auburn hairpiece. For those who believed in the divine right of kings, this wasn't merely brutal, it was blasphemous. But Mary's true genius lay in understanding exactly how powerful her martyrdom would become. In her final hours, she orchestrated every detail of her death with the precision of a master dramatist. The blood-red petticoat revealed beneath her black dress, chosen specifically to symbolize Catholic martyrdom. The small wooden crucifix clutched in her hands, the prayers spoken in Latin loud enough for all to hear. Mary transformed her execution from Elizabeth's political solution into her own political weapon. The immediate aftermath proved Mary's calculations correct. Catholic Europe erupted in outrage. Philip II of Spain, who had been hesitating about his planned invasion of England, now had the perfect justification for what would become the Spanish Armada. Mary's death didn't eliminate the Catholic threat to Elizabeth's throne. It gave it a martyred saint and a battle cry. Even Elizabeth, for all her political cunning, seemed to recognize she had been outmaneuvered. Her public displays of grief, her claims that she had signed the death warrant without fully understanding its implications, her persecution of those who had carried out the execution, all of it reeked of damage control. The woman who had spent her entire reign carefully crafting her public image had allowed herself to be painted as a kinslayer and a destroyer of legitimate monarchy. Perhaps most disturbingly, Mary's execution revealed how easily the machinery of state could be turned toward the systematic destruction of inconvenient individuals. The 19 years of imprisonment, the careful documentation of every alleged plot, the legal proceedings that gave a veneer of justice to what was fundamentally political murder, it was all remarkably modern in its bureaucratic thoroughness. Mary Stuart was erased methodically, officially, with full legal sanction. Yet 4 centuries later, it's Mary we remember with fascination, not her executioners. Her story endures because it captures something essential about the relationship between power and vulnerability, between political necessity and human cost. She was simultaneously a queen and a prisoner, a political schemer and a victim, a Catholic martyr and a Protestant threat. These contradictions make her human in ways that pure heroes or villains never could be. The messy, brutal reality of her death also serves as a reminder that even in an age of elaborate court ceremony and diving kingship, violence remained terrifyingly intimate and personal. The executioner's trembling hands, the blood seeping through the floorboards, the small dog emerging from beneath Mary's skirts, these details ground grand political narratives in visceral human experience. Mary, Queen of Scots, died as she had lived, on her own terms, transforming apparent defeat into lasting victory. Her executioners severed her head, but they could not kill her story. In the end, that story became her most enduring form of revenge.